In the spring of 1931, a black and white photograph arrived at the Smithsonian Archives. At first glance, it seemed ordinary, a woman in a simple cotton dress holding her young son against the backdrop of a weathered fence and an endless Kansas horizon. A quiet moment from the Depression era, preserved in silver and shadow. Dr. Margaret Chen adjusted her glasses as she studied the image. She noted the mother's worn shoes, the boy's patched clothing, signs of hardship but also of endurance. It could have been any family, any farm, any story of survival, yet something about it refused to sit quietly in the past. Her hand hovered above the magnifying glass. She leaned closer. The mother's face radiated warmth, protective, soft, filled with love. But the boy, his expression was not that of a child. His gaze cut forward, sharp and deliberate, his arms hanging stiff at his sides instead of melting into his mother's embrace. Margaret whispered under her breath, unsettled. She noted it in her log, unusual family photograph. Recommend further research into the Hartwell lineage. She had no idea this single picture would draw her into a mystery buried for nearly a century, one that questioned a mother's love and the secrets families hide in plain sight. 3 days later, Margaret drove through the winding back roads of Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. She was headed to the Victorian home of Elia Hartwell, the woman who had donated the photograph before her death at 97. Locals remembered Elia as quiet, meticulous, and devoted to preserving her family's history. At the door, Margaret was welcomed by Elia's great niece, Sarah Morrison, a librarian from Philadelphia. Sarah, with strands of gray threaded through her brown hair, spoke warmly as she guided Margaret inside. The house felt frozen in time. Hardwood floors groaned underfoot. The walls were lined with portraits, each labeled in Elia's careful handwriting. She never married, Sarah explained softly. No children. Her work was keeping the Hartwell story alive. She always said photographs were more than pictures. They were windows into souls. They revealed what people tried to hide. In the study, cluttered with magnifying glasses and albums, Sarah handed Margaret a leather-bound journal. These are Aunt Elia's notes about the 1931 photograph, she said. Margaret opened it carefully. One line stopped her cold. The boy in her arms. Why do his eyes hold such darkness? What truth did Thomas carry that none of us ever understood? Thomas? Margaret asked. Sarah hesitated, her face clouding. That's where it gets complicated. Growing up, I heard whispers. Some said Thomas was Ruth Hartwell's son, taken by influenza. Others swore he wasn't her child at all, just someone she cared for. And then there were those who said he never existed. Later, over coffee in the kitchen, photographs spilled across the worn wooden table. One image showed Ruth alone, taken months after the first. She looked hollow, weary. The boy was gone. On the back, in faded ink, was a chilling inscription. After Thomas left us, may God forgive what we allowed to happen. A cold shiver ran down Margaret's spine. Sarah then produced a third photograph hidden away in the attic. It showed Ruth with a different child, lighter hair, bright eyes, a gentle smile that mirrored her own features. This, Sarah whispered, was Ruth's real son, James. He died of pneumonia in early 1931, just days after this was taken. The implication struck Margaret hard. If James was gone, then who was the boy in the other photograph, the one whose eyes seemed far too old for his years? Margaret carried the images back to Washington. She showed them to Dr. James Patterson, an expert in photographic forensics. His analysis deepened the mystery. The first photograph, the one with the dark-haired boy, was genuine, yet its grain was subtly different around the child's face, as though the image itself resisted explanation. More unsettling still, when he compared the picture of Ruth with James to the one with the strange boy, he found something impossible. Same background, same shadows, same tear in Ruth's dress, same scuff on her shoe. These weren't images taken months apart, they were taken within hours of each other. The ground beneath Margaret seemed to shift. Determined, she traveled to Millfield, Kansas, the Hartwells' hometown. Local records confirmed that James Hartwell had died in February 1931, but there was no mention, no trace at all, of a child named Thomas. Finally, she was led to Frank Morrison, a 94-year-old man whose family once lived next door to the Hartwells. When Margaret placed the photograph of the dark-haired boy in his hands, Frank's breath caught. His frail fingers trembled. "Dear God," he whispered, "I never thought I'd see him again." His voice lowered as if afraid the walls might still hear. "Ruth called him Thomas, but I doubt that was his real name. He arrived not long after James died. Nobody knew where he came from. She claimed she was only caring for him. But that boy, there was something wrong about him. He knew things, things no child should, private matters, secrets from before he ever came to town. Even the animals feared him. Dogs would hide. Cattle grew restless. It was as if he didn't belong here." Margaret leaned closer. "What became of him?" Frank's eyes darkened. "One summer night he vanished. Ruth never spoke of it, but the next morning she was different, hollow, like she had carried a burden too great for words." And Margaret understood this mystery was only just beginning. Relief never lasts without shadows. Ruth may have found a measure of peace, but those who knew her swore she was never the same. Within months, she left Millfield behind and never returned. Margaret leaned forward when Frank Morrison's voice dropped to a whisper. "No one reported the boy missing," he said. "Not a soul. It was as if the entire town silently agreed he had never been here. Even Ruth carried on as though Thomas had never existed. But I'll tell you something I have never told another living soul. 3 nights after he vanished, I passed Ruth's farm. She was in the yard, digging behind the barn by lantern light, digging deep." Margaret's pulse quickened. She phoned Sarah Morrison the moment she left the care home. By that evening, the two women were on the road bound for the remains of the Hartwell farm. The land, long abandoned, now belonged to a local farming cooperative. Robert Jensen, the current owner, met them at the gate. A gruff but fair man in his 60s, he admitted he'd grown up hearing stories about the cursed Hartwell place. When Margaret explained their purpose, he not only gave permission to search, but even provided his ground-penetrating radar, the same device he used to check irrigation lines. The farmhouse lay in ruins. Roof collapsed, windows shattered, the skeleton of a life weathered by time. But the barn still stood, its faded red boards crumbling with age. Margaret and Sarah walked the land with old photographs in hand, matching angles, tracing memories. At last they found it, the rise in the earth where Ruth had once stood with both boys framed against the farmhouse. "Frank said she was digging behind the barn," Margaret murmured. They turned toward the spot, grass and weeds choking the ground. The radar would see what their eyes could not. By midday, Robert pushed the machine methodically across the soil. The screen flickered, then steadied. "There," he said, stopping. "Something's buried, about 4 feet down, rectangular." Margaret's heart raced. "How big?" Robert hesitated. "The size of a large suitcase, maybe a small coffin." Sarah's fingers gripped Margaret's arm. There was only one way to know. Margaret made the call. If human remains lay beneath, the discovery had to be handled properly. Sheriff David Martinez arrived within the hour, bringing with him a forensic team and Dr. Linda Chen, a state anthropologist. The old barn stood silent as the wind pushed through its broken boards. The dig began. At first they worked with shovels, but as they reached depth the tools became brushes, trowels, the delicate instruments of patience. Then came the call. "Something here!" Soil fell away to reveal a crude wooden box, its joints rough, built in haste. Dr. Chen's brow furrowed. Not a carpenter's work. Someone made this quickly, under pressure. The box was lifted with care. Sheriff Martinez documented every angle. When the latch was pried open, a brittle cloth fell back, revealing a small skeleton. Yet what should have been certainty only deepened the mystery. "The proportions are wrong," Dr. Chen whispered. "The body is child-sized, but the skull, the teeth, this is the mouth of an adult." Even Margaret could see it, an unsettling mismatch of youth and age. Before she could dwell, her phone rang. James Patterson's voice buzzed urgently through the line. "Margaret, I think I know what you've found. There was a boy in Nebraska, 1930. His name was Timothy Walsh. He had progeria, a rare condition that makes children age decades within just a few years. Severe behavioral issues. He vanished from a state facility a year before your photograph was taken." Margaret's chest tightened as the puzzle rearranged itself. "Are you saying Thomas was Timothy Walsh?" James continued. "Progeria was almost unknown then. His body aged like an old man's, but his mind was sharp, too sharp for a child. Records describe him as unsettling, too knowing, manipulative even, as if he could read people. To those in the 1930s, he must have seemed unnatural." The truth weighed heavy. Ruth Hartwell had not been hiding a ghostly presence. She had been sheltering a sick, dying boy whose condition medicine would not understand for decades. Sarah's voice trembled when Margaret relayed the news. "So he didn't vanish. He died there, in her care." Margaret nodded. "She must have buried him herself, not to conceal cruelty, but to protect him and herself. In that time, people would not have understood. They might have believed something monstrous had occurred." Weeks later, after DNA confirmed the remains matched Timothy Walsh's family in Nebraska, the boy was finally given a proper resting place. A headstone was erected in Millfield Cemetery. Timothy Walsh, 1920-1931. A child who endured too much, finally at peace. For Margaret, the meaning of the haunting photograph was now clear. Ruth's embrace had been real. The look in Timothy's eyes was not malice but awareness of suffering, of decline, of a body betraying him too soon. Ruth Hartwell had seen beyond the fear, beyond the illness. She had offered love when most would have turned away, and carried the secret of her compassion to her grave. Margaret slid the photograph into its archival sleeve, her heart steady. It would no longer sit as a mystery, but as a testament, a reminder that sometimes what unsettles us is not something sinister, only something we have not yet learned to understand.